All right, it looks like we are recording.
No, yep.
We're still a little blurry, I think, but I think we're okay. It comes and goes, you know. It's like I go through these blurry phases.
Right.
But so I've got Otto Excelsior here with me again today. This is the show that doesn't have a name yet, but there's always hope that someday it will have a name. And I am your host, pannobhasa. Go by other names that need not be mentioned. The last time we talked, it was about the spiritual power of literature, and we mentioned that, or I think, yeah, I guess both of us kind of were discussing how there really haven't been any recent scriptures. And then in the comments below the YouTube video, there's somebody mentioning, well, what about this and what about that? And so, yeah, I suppose there have been attempts at scripture and at forming new religions since, I guess, Mormonism, or some would say Marxism, have been like the latest additions to the religious pantheon, so to speak. And it just got me thinking. Also, I mentioned Mein Kampf in the last video, and somebody was very much taking issue with that, because it turns out that there are people out there who still have a high respect for Adolf Hitler. And not only that, but there's actually more or less of a spiritual movement, like at least a quasi-spiritual movement of Esoteric Hitlerism. And it turns out that Otto here knows more about Esoteric Hitlerism than anybody else I know, even though I actually do know more or less of an Esoteric Hitlerist, but even he doesn't know as much about Esoteric Hitlerism as Otto does.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. He's this person, he's very mild-mannered, devout Buddhist, but he also is firmly persuaded that Adolf Hitler is now in the Buddhist Tawatimsa heaven, like a very, very high and powerful deity, and that he was essentially godlike before he died, which is how you get into heaven if you're a Buddhist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, you die with a godlike mind and you become a god. You die with an animal-like mind and you become an animal, that kind of a thing. Most of us die with a human mind, and so we wind up being human again. But yeah, so we're going to talk about Adolf Hitler and some of the literature that has grown up discussing Hitler, especially in a more or less spiritual sense, just for the sake of free discussion and open-mindedness and so forth. I can personally say that I am not a Hitlerist. I'm not a Nazi, not a fascist, but Hitler is an interesting guy. I have read a few books about Hitler. I read the big biography by a man named Bullock, if I remember correctly, and it was written shortly after World War II, but it was written back in a day when historians really tried not to have an axe to grind. They still had the what we call the liberal or Enlightenment ideal of objective truth telling, which has completely fallen by the wayside lately, last few decades. Also, I read A.J.P. Taylor's The Origins of the Second World War, which mentioned Hitler, after he became, a major political figure. It overlooked his youth and so forth. And I've read a few other bits and pieces about Adolf Hitler, or Adolf, as some of the people who take him more seriously than I do. But I mean, I don't consider Hitler to have been just pure evil. Like, if there was like a poll, just like a poll given to the masses, who was the evilest person who ever lived, probably Hitler would win. He'd wind up at number one.
Right.
Mainly because of just the official narrative and so forth.
Even though Stalin outperformed him on just about every scale, poor Joe Stalin, he never really gets a break with the evil.
Yeah. Stalin killed more people than Hitler did, and Mao killed more people than Stalin and Hitler combined, but you can't badmouth the left, and so.
But remember too, Stalin not only killed a lot more people, he actually won and was able to dominate Europe and just, grind all these people under the totalitarian heel. Hitler lost, the war.
Yeah, and it's the victors who write the history books.
Yeah, I guess so.
So, yeah, it was especially since the era of Trump, which may not be over, but, as soon as Trump started running seriously for president and started looking especially like he was going to win, he was literally Adolf Hitler, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Demonized pretty much the way Hitler has been demonized. And so it causes one to become skeptical, at least, of the official narrative. And what I've read about Hitler is, and he was very similar to Napoleon in a lot of ways. The anti-Semitism might be the main exception. And, I mean, who is running the media and so forth. And so that really couldn't, just be overlooked. He couldn't just go down in history as the second Napoleon. They really had a lot of similarities. It's like the whole Russia fiasco and just not knowing when to call it good and quit while you're ahead, kind of a thing.
Right.
The best defense is a good offense, just being unpredictable and so forth. So yeah, I mean, he was an interesting person, and in some ways he was, he did have certain virtues, even from a leftist point of view. He is very much against cruelty to animals. I think he banned animal experimentation and so forth.
Germany was the first modern Western country to ban vivisection and other animal experimentations. This is often made much of by Savitri Devi. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm not. A lot of the things that we take for granted today, Germany at that time also did a lot to preserve its ecology. They were very ecologically conscious. Great parks were built, and it was felt very important to preserve the natural resources of wood and water and clean air, not simply to exploit them, but to give people a wonderful backdrop in which to live and from which to draw inspiration. And this isn't
at least in German people.
Right, specifically German people. But to say now they didn't invent this. This is actually kind of an idea that was bopping around in like the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a lot of places. I lived in the city of Buffalo for a long time. Beautiful city, and there was a time when they just went all out planting trees and creating what we would today call green spaces. This was not a new idea, but they took it to a national level. So yeah, there were a lot of things. He also did things like ban smoking in public places. That was one of the things that people thought was, this is a horrible, horrible Nazi regime, which just like keeps people from smoking in public places. They had huge campaigns about how cigarette smoking caused lung cancer. And you would be, if you went to Germany at that time, in a time machine, those are some of the things that you would actually find very familiar about Nazi-dominated society. So,
and back in those days, it was condemned as symptomatic of fascism, whereas now it's been pretty much mainstreamed by the liberal mainstream.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely a mixed bag. And of course, I think it's been rightly pointed out. Probably you've heard more lies about Adolf Hitler than about any other man in history. One of the aspects of World War II, which I find very interesting, is if you've got to look at these things from a larger perspective. In World War I, which was basically World War II, the beta version, when the Allies, and specifically, basically it was Britain versus Germany, were fighting Germany, one of the fronts they fought on was the propaganda war. And this is when British writers, even men like G.K. Chesterton, certainly Kipling, Wells, all these guys all banded together to write about how evil the Germans were and about how Prussianism. In fact, I just finished reading a novel that was written during the First World War, and it was all about how, there were a few good Germans, but they'd been Prussianized, and they just killed women and children without a thought. And how, basically after the war, you wouldn't want to be one, because if they showed their filthy little noses outside of their filthy little country, they'd get their noses punched. So it wasn't punch a Nazi back then. I guess it was punch a Prussian or any kind of German in general.
It's interesting to me that just ethnically, the Prussians were not Germanic, that they were actually spoke a Baltic language. At least Prussian was a Baltic language. It was more related to Lithuanian than it was to any of the Germanic languages.
Oh yeah, this idea of a united Germany that's another very recent thing, and that's something we have Napoleon to thank for on a certain level. He helped consolidate when he created the Confederacy of the Rhine. Before that, there were so many independent states in Germany, each with many of them with their own dialects, that nobody really knows how many. More than 300. And this would change from day to day because this was still old style feudalism. If you were Sir David and you had like your domain was like this 20 acres or whatever, you were the sovereign lord of that. But then if you married Lady Dee Dee or something, and she also had like 20 acres, then the two of you would have, so you'd go from 2 countries to 1 country. But then if somebody else, like if you sold part of your parcels, there'd be 2 countries again. So it just changed every year. Nobody really knew. So yeah, Germany was very much divided. It was worse than Italy was before the unification. That's in fact why they had the song Deutschland über alles, was Germany above all, not Germany over all other countries, but don't worry about if you're a Saxon or a Hessian or you're Prussian or Bavarian, Germany above all that. It was an attempt to try to mold a country out of all these disparate parts. So, but anyway, getting back to the First World War, when Germany was, even then much more divided. The propaganda coming out from the Allied camp was amazing. Okay, people were talking quite seriously, and it's great to read the books and newspapers from back then, quite seriously about Germans roasting babies over fires.
Huns.
Yeah, Huns. They just stick them in a bayonet and roast them over the fire and eat them. And of course, raping nuns was always a favorite. Things like that. So the destruction of churches. And after the war was over, the British government actually apologized and said, well, you know what? They weren't really eating babies. We are sorry about that, but it's war. So,
They could have.
They could have. Well, no, they said, look, lying about the enemy is part of war. Back then, we still had a war office, a ministry of war. They didn't have these euphemisms, defense, So they were much more honest about what they did. But after World War II, especially because Russia was still very much a power and continued occupying the parts of Europe that it had rolled over during the war, they basically kept the propaganda going. And as a result, I mean, they never really deconstructed the anti-German propaganda the way they did in the First World War. So it's very instructive when you read all of the memoirs, like Churchill's memoirs or any of the generals, Montgomery or Eisenhower's. They never mention a lot of stuff that is mentioned in general in the German propaganda. And I'm not going to get into, I don't want to get into details about this because it'll sidetrack things, and what will start happening in the comments section. But
yeah. I mean, like, I would like to just mention that, I mean, as far as I know, neither one of us is denying that the Nazis were mean to Jews on a relatively large scale, although it's like everything gets twisted and exaggerated.
Yes, and the anti-Semitism of the National Socialists or the Nazis or whatever you want to call them, I think it's very real, but it's not really understood very well. And even the structure of the party and the way Germany was run is not really understood very well by people. They watch the Hitler channel, the History Channel, I should say. I don't watch television very much, but I used to work overnights at a place, and they'd have the History Channel going on all night. And you're doing chores and stuff around the building, and you just kind of look at it. And I just have coworkers; they just like something on in the background. And you start noticing it's like all these Hitler newsreels, all these Nazi newsreels, and they would begin each show with this. They'd have someone say, "We must remember that Hitler was very, 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 very bad. Now Hitler's SS." And they show like all these, and it's all newsreels and like Leni Riefenstahl stuff. And
why their uniforms look so cool.
Yeah, and then at the end of the show, they'd say, but of course, Hitler was very, 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 very bad. Stay tuned for Hitler's Schwarzkopf and later, So it was like just showing this cartoon coloring book version of the Third Reich. And what's interestingly, it's propaganda made by the Third Reich that's being beamed into people's homes. So obviously they're going to be, that I think is going to overwhelm any kind of a little reminder of 30-second reminder at the end. Yeah, people have this coloring book idea of how Nazi Germany worked. The fact is that Hitler was not very secure in his power. He had a lot of people who were jostling to possibly overthrow him. You had the Rome Putsch, or as it's sometimes called, the Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler killed off hundreds of, some of them his closest comrades, who had helped found the party and were old party men.
What's the two brothers?
Yeah, Otto and the Strassers.
Yeah, the Strasser brothers. Yeah, it's like a lot of people don't realize that one of the reasons why he killed one of the Strasser brothers and the other one had to flee the country was that I think it was Otto wanted National Socialism to be really socialistic, and Hitler really didn't care whether it was socialistic or not, so long as he was in power.
Right. That was one of the issues with National Socialism. At the time, and we'll dig into this a little bit. You got to remember that at the time, Germany, and again, we Americans don't understand a lot of things about, for example, being a conservative or reactionary. I mean, to us in America, if you're a conservative or even a reactionary, you're going back to 1776, pal, and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Adams and that maniac Paul Revere and that Thomas Paine. That guy was a radical. But and that's the point. We consider that to be conservatism. But in Europe, when they're being conservative or reactionary, they're not going to 1776. They're going to 776. Okay, a whole different outlook. To those guys, a conservative from that point of view, guys like George Washington are some of the worst radicals of the Enlightenment. So I think that's something that makes it difficult for us sometimes to understand the political maneuverings. But in Germany at the time, there was a very old conservative idea of class structure. Okay, if you were going to be a general or a high-ranking officer, your last name was something like von something or Prince something. You were a nobleman. And if you were like the Hitler family, for example, Hitler's dad was a petty bourgeois official. And under that kind of a system, the most Hitler could ever hope to rise to is maybe an NCO in the German army, possibly an honorary officer or something like that.
Well, but before he became chancellor, he literally had to have German citizenship bestowed.
Yeah, he was Austrian. Yeah. But so yeah, the society was very structured, and workers were considered to be very low down. And at that time, the communists, the socialists, were recruiting workers, calling them proletarians, and their attitude to the workers were, "Oh, you proletarians," which is really it's a derogatory term, really.
I think it originally came from the Latin term for people who have nothing to contribute to society but children.
Exactly. Yeah, that was one
population.
They created cannon fodder for the state. I was just actually reading something in All Escalius about that. But in before. But so even the left was at the time kind of putting them down and saying, "Oh, look at the way these people treat you, you mere proletarians. What you've got to do is rise up and kick their asses." Whereas the National Socialists came and said that you, as a worker in a factory, were just as valid a person and a contributor to the state as this guy who might be an engineer and he's working at a drafting table. Their idea was you raised the workers up to the dignity of all other Germans, and we don't think much of that. We have a rather egalitarian society here in the United States, certainly compared with like Europe. So this was like a quantum leap, and this was something that was very appealing to people at the time. So for us, we think again of the idea, all men are created equal, and all these documents that we consider these ideas that we consider in our founding documents about, basic, what we consider basic human rights, inalienable rights. In fact, you didn't have that in Germany. They were looking back to a time when, everyone knew their place, and the further back you went, the better it was, kind of deal. That's why the Nazis in their song, the Horst Wessel song, they sing about resisting the Reds, the communists, but also resisting the reactionaries, the right, because they consider themselves to be, and I think it's a valid label, a third position movement, neither socialist nor capitalist. They were opposed to both.
It seems to me that, if I remember correctly, Hitler became a Nazi or a National Socialist to begin with, because after World War I, he was one of the relatively few soldiers who didn't lose his job. He remained in the military, and he was assigned to check out this little party that was in some Bavarian beer hall. to see if it would be useful for like working class people and like unemployed soldiers to compete with the communists. And so he joined, and then he turned out liking it, and he did better at that than he did in the military. So he just became like one of the leaders of the party.
Well, that's another whole. His association with the army is another whole thing. But getting back to let's circle around back to that. But we'll circle back. But I want to finish going on about what were we talking about? You see, you made me lose my track. No, we were talking about Hitler's position in the party and and how some were like more socialist, some were more capitalist. Joseph Goebbels was power in the party. There was at one point it could have been that he would have taken over basically the party and either had Hitler done away with or Hitler joined him. And he was very socialist. I mean, if you read Goebbels' writings when he was a younger man, it's very interesting. If you read his diaries, which we have now, but he was like, very pro-Soviet, very pro. We need some real socialism in this National Socialism sort of thing. But he modified his views in order to come into the Hitler camp, and Hitler allowed him to retain a huge influence.
He seemed to be very much impressed by Hitler's speeches and just Hitler's presence. And then before that, he was a follower of one of the Strassers, the one who was insisting on more socialism.
Right.
There's one.
Go on.
Continue.
Well, I was going to say, keep in mind too about Goebbels and Hitler. Yes, he was very impressed with Hitler, and Goebbels was coming from the point of view that one of the most important things in any political movement is its propaganda, and he used it in its morally neutral tone of being able to convey your ideas. And he was captivated with Hitler's ability to do this. He really, really was impressed with it, and this is, I think, one of the deciding factors, certainly, that made him throw in with Hitler. I don't know how much he was really personally worshipful of Hitler. I mean, there was that to a point. They were very close. But at the same time, a lot of his diaries and records, well, when you look at them, it's interesting because as he became more powerful in the party, he was more careful about what he wrote down because you never knew when Himmler might just turn on him and decide to seize his diary. So he would say things, and this is just my interpretation of this. I haven't had other historians say this. He would talk about Hitler making a real wackadoodle decision about something, militarily, for example. And Hitler did do these things. And he said, the Fuhrer walks with the confidence of a sleepwalker. I'm sure he'll get us through this. And it's like, I don't really think that's what he was thinking at the time. I think he was saying, what are we going to do? He's like walking around. He's not even looking. It's like he's walking with his eyes closed. But he had to be careful what he wrote. So especially towards the end of his life, I think Goebbels was fascinated with Hitler. Certainly he was very respectful of him, but he wanted that power. He really felt that he should have been the Fuhrer, and I think he wanted to succeed Hitler. And there's a good argument that Goebbels engineered Hitler staying in the bunker. Hitler could have gone to the Bavarian Alps where they were ready for a last stand, and the war might have lasted another year or two. But Goebbels convinced him that, no, get rid of everybody else. I'll stick with you. We'll commit suicide, but before we do, you'll make me the Fuhrer, right? And Goebbels got his wish for, what was it, like a day or two? He actually got to be the leader of Germany. I don't think he actually had the title Fuhrer as such, but he was, bored of rubble as far as the eye could see. So he got his wish.
Well, before we get very far into this, I think the main purpose of what I'd like to talk about is like the spiritual aspect or the quasi-spiritual aspects of not necessarily Hitler himself, but of people's interpretations of him after the fact. And it just turned out that last night, my sweetheart and I were watching the Hitler channel, and there was this video about Hitler's fascination with Wagner, how it would he'd go into ecstasies listening to Wagner operas and so forth. And then I was thinking that, and my sweetheart happened to mention at the time that he was channeling. He was like channeling this, you go into this ecstasy listening to music. She has definitely an artistic temperament, and you're channeling some deeper force. And then that reminded me of his speeches where he just he'd essentially be channeling when he'd be delivering these impassioned speeches with his hair flopping around and his fist waving around, you know. He'd be yelling to the audience and they'd just be going nuts. And so, I mean, Hitler did have some sort of quasi-mystical element about him, about his personality, but I think that's largely irrelevant to the esoteric Hitlerists who are turning him into a god or an avatar or a messiah or something like this. And so, as I said at the beginning, you know more about this sort of thing than I do. I know relatively little about it. So, yeah, I mean, what do you have to say about Hitler as sort of the founder of some religion that never really struck traction in the mainstream?
Well, probably the first people to really start pushing the idea of a mystical Adolf Hitler were the SS, actually, when I think about it. Heinrich Himmler was very much of a neo-pagan mystic. We have evidence that Hitler was not overly impressed with Himmler's ideas on the subject, but you know, somebody was once talking to me about the neo-pagan aspects of National Socialism. So it was a pagan movement. Certainly the Pope at the time thought it was a pagan movement. He was the Catholic Church had a lot of problems with that.
Yeah, a heathen movement anyway.
But I think that the only religion that Adolf Hitler really wanted to be in Germany was the religion of National Socialism. I do think that it was meant to be a new cultural force, much like a religion. But as far as the mystical aspects at that time, I think that was basically the SS. And I'm sure there was a certain amount of Volkish kind of neo-paganism going about, but I would say that there were probably about as many neo-pagans in Germany at that time as there are in America or anywhere else today. They're not really a majority. And Hitler himself was not convinced that you could do a significant neo-pagan revival. There's somewhere a quote of his, something to the effect of like, well, you know, why should we go to Wotan when Woden fell before the Christians, you know? If that sort of idea that if paganism was all that great, why did it collapse? It's also interesting to know that Hitler surrounded himself not only with mystics, but like downright atheists. You know, Martin Bormann was very anti-Christian. Goebbels
Hitler was so politically oriented and socially oriented that, yeah, I don't think he had much mental energy left over to devote to religious or spiritual issues. I mean, he was really of this world, it seems to me.
Well, the thing about that, and this is the other thing too, Hitler, and again, he had, as you point out, he had a lot on his plate. He had a lot to do in this world, you know, and he bit off quite a bit, and I think more than he thought he was biting off when he became chancellor and took over Germany. But the physical politician, Adolf Hitler, you know, the German politician who was, obviously did a lot of things in this physical world of ours in the 30s and 40s, is a different matter from Adolf Hitler, the archetype. And this is something that this is how I approach esoteric Hitlerism, basically. You've got to separate the physical container from the avatar. Now, Hitler, I feel, is definitely an archetype. And, I'm something of an occultist. I've studied this sort of thing for a long time. Everything, just speaking from an occult standpoint, esoteric Hitlerism is perfectly valid as a spiritual or religious or magical pursuit. It's as valid as anything else, because you get to a point, and there's an understanding of this, where the actual symbols themselves are immaterial. It's the forces these symbols stir up within us.
Yeah, I would just point out that an entire religion, at least one, has been based on Moses, who, if you can believe Exodus and so forth, was a genocidal warlord.
Sure. Well, you know, it's like you say, the victors always write the histories, and one man's genocidal warlord is another man's ethnic cleanser, making everything nice and clean. You know, what is one from the ethnic cleansing?
Obeying the orders of God.
Well, that gets into that whole idea of the old-fashioned ethics of what God wants, God gets, and that's what good is, as opposed to an ethical good that stands above even God. God wouldn't do that. God can do whatever the hell God wants to do.
I got a question for you.
Sure.
It's like Hitler apparently considered himself to be like a Hegelian man of destiny. So you think that would have anything to do with like one of the seeds of esoteric Hitlerism? I mean, his own belief that he was like the Hegelian man of destiny who was going to change history single-handedly, practically.
Well, I don't know. Again, I don't think Hitler was directly involved with creating his own legend too much. I mean, aside from just like the normal propaganda channels, we hired people to do that. And the I think his ideas about destiny and all that came from his position. I mean, you can't have like an entire country hiling you all day without some. I'm a man of destiny, and in a sense he was. Although in another sense, the times produce the man. It's like talking about Trump. And I've said this before and discussed it with people. Trump is a symptom. He's not a cause. Hitler was a symptom of the times, not a cause. If Hitler hadn't come to power, it might have been Goebbels. It might have been one of the Strasser brothers. It might have been Goring, although.
And it could have been a Marxist.
And it very well could have been. People forget that there was actually, for a while, Bavaria was a Soviet Socialist republic for a short time. And again, the atrocities that the communists were committing were quite well known to everyone. In fact, that was another attitude in Germany at the time. Well, they're locking these guys up in camps, and that's exactly what the communists would be doing. So it was seen as, it kind of almost reminds me of like old New York City in the good old days when we had mass immigration from Europe, and they would hire the Irishmen and make them cops so they could beat up on the Italians. So it was like you didn't care for either one. So I think for a lot of people, you went with the Nazis because they were going to beat up the commies, but you wouldn't want to invite either of them to dinner necessarily. But I don't think Hitler himself. I mean, I think others picked up on that idea that he was a man of destiny, but I don't think he had anything in mind about founding any sort of a Hitlerian religion.
Yeah.
So
I agree with that.
That was
part of his problem, though. It seems to me, just reading the historical information about the historical person is he had such a grandiose idea of his role in the scheme of things that he started considering himself to be more or less infallible and started micromanaging all the military campaigns and that sort of thing.
Yeah, he also had health issues, which affected his ability to think clearly, I think. Sometimes that's pretty well acknowledged. I mean, by the end, he had symptoms of Parkinson's disease. He also had. I always thought this was interesting. Somewhere I found some photographs of the inner circle of the Nazi Party. Hitler and Himmler and Goring and all those guys, Goebbels. And it was shortly after they started really being successful and starting gaining power. And they were all dressed in really expensive suits. They're all young men then. And they all were like, wow, we made it. We're a success. They all look like, cool, this is really groovy. We made it. And after that, and after that, you rarely saw any of these guys in photos without their uniforms or whatever. But it's interesting. We know for a fact that Hitler started having a lot of trouble with his digestion. And I think this has a lot to do with the pressure of all the things he was doing. It really took a toll on him physically. Of course, he had to be the Fuhrer and just like snap off these orders like nothing. But I think it really, really got to him, this huge pressing burden that he took on himself. An absolute ruler, and not that he really was an absolute ruler. We've discussed that earlier. The Nazi state was not nearly as monolithic as the propaganda would have you think. But still, to take all that on yourself is an immense burden, the burden of omniscience, it's been called.
Definitely a high-stress job.
What's that?
Definitely a high-stress job.
Yes, very high stress. And it really started stressing him out. He began taking all sorts of weird pills. He was, as a World War I veteran, they had all these home remedies. And they used to drink fusel oil. This was considered to be something good for your stomach. So Hitler was actually drinking fusel oil, which is not really meant for human consumption and stuff like that. And of course, he had a doctor shooting him up with all kinds of wacky stuff. So Yeah, that really affected, I think, his health towards the end, and certainly affected his decision making.
Yeah. Let's get on to like what sort of beliefs, what would compose esoteric Hitlerism as like a quasi spiritual path, or religion, or whatever you want to call it. Because I know almost nothing about it other than what our mutual friend says about Hitler being in heaven and having done nothing wrong and so forth. But
Well, it's kind of interesting. I would, and again, do not set myself up as an expert on this subject. My ignorance is vast, but it's like pebbles. We pick up a few pebbles on the seashore. But speaking from my current state of knowledge and ignorance, I would say that really esoteric Hitlerism began in the modern. We can look at two people basically: Savitri Devi, who was living in India at the end of the Second World War, and Miguel Serrano, who was living in Chile. And both of them basically became the founders of different threads of esoteric Hitlerism. But what's very interesting about Hitlerism, esoteric or otherwise, but especially esoteric Hitlerism, is that it really doesn't have what I call a centralized creed, aside from honoring Hitler as an avatar and as a spiritual force, godlike being, or even a god, depending. Because and again, I was expecting we talk about books, so I don't have all my notes at my fingertips. But esoteric Hitlerism, you've got Savitri Devi, who is a Hindu, so her esoteric Hitlerism is very Hinduistic. You've got Miguel Serrano. He came out of Western esoteric tradition, which is basically, I'll get in trouble for this, but the short version is it's Western esotericism at his time was basically a mishmash of things from like Blavatsky and the Theosophists, certain ideas in Hinduism and yoga, certain ideas coming out of Freemasonry and things like that. So his Hitler was a different Hitler from Savitri Devi's. You also have esoteric Hitlerists like Matt Cole, who was more of a Christian, but a positive Christian. So I've seen esoteric Hitlerism be approached from a Christian perspective, a neo-pagan perspective, an occult perspective. I haven't seen a Muslim esoteric Hitlerism yet, but there could be such a thing. So Hitler, really, it's very interesting. He's actually able to unite people of all these different spiritual backgrounds, who can all agree on him as being this being of power, this archetype. And certainly at the time he was alive, what's the old saying? He strode the world like a colossus, at least for a little while. I remember there was I think it was Time magazine had him on the cover at one time. I'm sure he was on there a couple of times, and they described it as the most hated and most loved man in the world. And that's what he was at the time. People hated Hitler, and some people really loved Hitler. And to a point where Savitri Devi, and we were speaking of this earlier, I really think she had like survivor syndrome. When the Third Reich fell and she was still alive, she felt guilty. She personally felt guilty about this. And I think this is what catapulted her regard for Hitler onto a religious level in some ways.
So it was Savitri Devi who thought that Hitler was an avatar of Vishnu, the one that comes after Gautama Buddha.
Kalki.
So he would be Kalki, who would be the one who rides the white horse and brings about the new golden age at the end of the Kali Yuga.
Right. Yeah,
so but she was saying this after Hitler had already committed suicide in the bunker.
Right. I don't think she had any of these ideas until after the defeat in 1945.
Yeah, so she's just assuming that Hitler would be in a heaven realm right now, preparing to get on the white horse and
right.
his role as Kalki.
Mm-hmm. And there is an argument, and actually this is something that I kind of see in some of these ideas. Miguel Serrano also, and I know it should be Serrano, but I'm not really good at saying that. So, but he also, again, he's an occultist basically. who had picked up a lot of Hinduism. He actually went to India to study Hinduism, unlike Renan, but that's another story. He had this idea that Hitler had to lose the war. You see, that's one of the things that face esoteric Hitlerists. If Hitler really was this divine being, or at least an avatar of a divine being sent to our Earth, on a special mission, how was it that he lost the war? And didn't just lose the war, but I lost it in such a way as it basically destroyed this Europe that he had claimed to be the protector over.
That was hard for the Christians to explain also. How did their savior sent by God wind up crucified just like killed in a really horrible way?
That's a good point, actually. There is a similarity there. Of course, Christ's death was, more personal and introverted, I guess you could say, since it only basically concerned him, whereas Hitler's death and failure consumed the entire continent and much of the rest of the world. Even the most sincere Hitler apologists would have to look at this, and it'd be hard not to call this a failure on an epic level. I told you my aunt, who lived in Germany during the war as a small child, when I asked her, when I was younger, because you're fascinating, what do you remember about the Hitler years? What do you remember about the war? And she didn't miss a beat. She just said rubble, as far as the eye could see, in every direction, nothing but rubble. And I'm thinking, wow, imagine being a 5-year-old child and you wake up and that's the first thing you see every morning is nothing but rubble to the horizon. So yeah, how do you explain this if this is the case? And Serrano comes up with the idea that, well, he only lost the physical war. He won the spiritual war. And one can see in this a way when you've been defeated, because again, Serrano, like Savitri Devi, was actually alive during World War II. All right, these guys were rooting the Third Reich on. Serrano himself was involved in fascist politics in Chile at the time, and they had in fact had a massacre there of National Socialists that tried to pull a coup, and it was young students, young idealists, and you can look it up on Wikipedia. But the short version is basically they tried to pull off a coup. It wasn't successful. They persuaded them to surrender, and then they were just all shot summarily, no trial or anything. Just shoot them. They're Nazis. Shoot a Nazi, and that was one of the things, in fact, that converted Serrano. This was seen in Chile. It's like, well, that's pretty mean, So anyway, these were people who had been rooting on the Third Reich and who had an emotional commitment to it. And when it failed like that, they had to do something to preserve their feeling that this was the right way to go. They both had a more than just political feel about it. But I think it was after the loss of the war, the physical war, if you like, that the spiritual aspect became more important, because you had to have a victory somewhere. You couldn't have the victory in the physical world. So Serrano could say that there was actually a spiritual victory. And Savitri Devi could say, well, it's a setback because this is a war that's going to go on for like millions of years. She's using those broad Upanishadic sweeps of time kind of thing.
Yeah.
Where Serrano is talking to Hitler in the astral realm. In the astral realm, everything's great, but unfortunately, we live here. And
so again, it's similar to Christianity.
Yeah, and that could actually just reflect a mechanism inherent in all religions nowadays. Post by Campbell, of course. So
yeah, especially in the West.
Right. So that's one of the important points about separating. You have to separate the spiritual Hitler from the physical 20th century politician Hitler kind of deal, because the two don't really, there are fundamental differences between the two.
Which is one reason why I've mainly been interested in just the historical figure, and it never really made a lot of sense to me, the esoteric Hitlerism part, spiritualizing the man, because it seems to me that he was not particularly spiritual, so it's it's something I can't really relate to very well. I was invited onto the Hitlerism group on Minds, and I joined it as a favor to a friend, but it's like I couldn't really relate to it much. I couldn't really contribute much to it.
It's Esoteric Hitlerism has created some very, very interesting philosophical work. Again, now I'm speaking as an occultist. It's perfectly valid as any other occult pursuit. You're probably familiar with the idea of chaos magic. The idea is, again, what you choose to focus on. Aleister Crowley had some wonderful exercises for this. I think it was Liber Vel Astarte or something. But basically, you can take a bottle of water if you like, and you can venerate it, and you can create. I almost said karma, but you can create a physical physical, yes, I think, but also a spiritual force that can be concentrated on that.
You'd be creating a conventional reality.
Right.
Not ultimate reality, but like a conventional frame of reference that everyone agrees on, and that gives it power because it's like the framework of their reality.
Right. And that is a building from the bottom up kind of thing, and that's something occultists do. That's one way you could differentiate a magician from a priest. But when it comes to esoteric Hitlerism, and again, now I'm going to leave behind the German politician, the physical shell that was the avatar. The actual avatar Hitler is an immensely powerful figure, immensely powerful. In fact, I stand in awe of the way Hitler has been able to dominate to this day, in many ways, our society and our discussion. What do you call someone you don't like on Twitter? They're a Nazi,
Really, Adolf Hitler. And also, I would add that to this day, he is still the dankest meme.
He is very much so. And he's still, it's interesting too, because it's that whole law of you get the opposite of what you want. I mean, in part, it was the Allies doing everything they could to demonize the hell out of Hitler all through the war, and then continuing to do so after the war.
And more successful that, I mean, his name and his mustache are now like literally taboo.
Yeah.
And nobody's naming their kid Adolf anymore. And nobody grows the toothbrush mustache anymore.
Very few. No, and again, we speak of occultism, magic. I don't like that term so much because it sounds like I'm pulling a rabbit out of a hat. But when you can take a piece of paper, draw some lines on it, and hold it up and make people cringe, you're affecting people at a distance without touching them. And you and I have seen Heru hold his small sign up about apologizing to Adolf Hitler for 80 years of lies, and somebody 20 yards away will start screaming. That's power.
People will just freak out. Yeah.
So it's no wonder that an occultist of any sort or someone with a spiritual bent would not be attracted to this power, attracted to this avatar.
Certain types of occultism, it's sort of like the book The Trickster and the Paranormal, where the violation of taboos generates power.
Yes.
And there is one of the ultimate taboos, that in like incest or necrophilia or something. Just Hitler himself has become this massive taboo.
Yeah, it's true. And a taboo with really cool uniforms, Hugo Boss. So, a great design sense. And especially, and again, it's this idea, they have demonized and propagandized us about Germany, for so long in World War II. And as I said, a lot of these ideas are perpetuated. They're either still supported, or they were just never really deconstructed, and so they remain, in our culture. So the power that Hitler's image has, the power that Hitler's ideas have, and especially the more they censor Hitler. When I was a younger person, there was I remember when the ACLU sued to allow the American Nazi Party to march. I think it was in Chicago or something. That would never happen today. But the idea was that in the marketplace of ideas, you have to let anyone, even the Nazis, present their ideas. So I remember, again, I was a much younger man. I was interested in this National Socialism. And again, it does draw your attention that there is a power there. And more than just what we can explain even, through normal rational means, that people are drawn to it. So I wanted to read about this stuff. And I came across a collection of articles written by who was it? I think he was like he's some kind of a National Socialist writer, but he was writing for the foreign market, explaining Nazism to like English and people like that. part of the propaganda. And it's like, oh, what we National Socialists believe. So I'm like, oh, this is cool. So I'm reading about National Socialism, and it's like, oh, well, we need to build up infrastructure for the country. It's like, I get along with that. And it's like, oh, we need to protect the environment. I'm like, oh, let's get along with that. It's like, oh, we need to ban smoking. It's like, well, it's kind of intrusive, but okay. Then it's like, oh, this poet wrote this poem and it was against the country. And I'm like, okay. And he should be liquidated. I'm like, whoa, that's it. All right. The minute you start liquidating people because they wrote a poem you don't like, that's when I say this is un-American. And this is where, and again, I'm now, of course, speaking about political National Socialism, but the fact is that you could do your own research and see for yourself. It's like, yeah, there's some good ideas here, but this is not an American thing. This is not something that maybe it worked in Germany, where they shoot people, if that's the kind of culture you want to have, where you execute people for saying something you don't like. And I hate to say it, we're moving toward that now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the Christians and the early Hebrews were very much on that page also. And I was going to mention this earlier, but then I forgot to mention it, or just we got sidetracked or something. But I would say about as close to a religious element of Nazism that was found in historical Nazism, not the esoteric aspect, would be just sort of the group mind that they were trying to cultivate, like at the Nuremberg rallies and that sort of thing, where you're sort of transcending the individual and becoming a member of the Volk or the nation.
Right. Yeah, that's very much a ritual, and very, very much that can be modeled using occult or psychospiritual terminology. But those rallies and stuff, they go on about them. They were really like going to a rock show today. That was something for the faithful to go to. They'd get charged up. It was really, a catharsis for people. But again, getting back to, that's one image, but getting back to the actual nuts and bolts of the party, those brown shirts and guys marching all around like that, they went on strike at one point. The SA actually went on strike because they thought Hitler wasn't paying them enough. And there were reports of, you go down to the Brown House, that was like the headquarters. They'd be pissing and moaning, that fucking Hitler, he better come up and, hey, he's got a limousine. Well, there was actually, they did actually argue. There was a lot of discontent in the ranks sometimes.
Yeah, that could be one reason why he sort of superseded them by the SS.
Yeah, that was a big
unmanageable. Like the Rome Putsch was largely because Ernst Röhm wanted more power for, he wanted the SA to become paramilitary and to be merged into the German army and all that.
Yeah, what was it? The German army had, what was it, like 100,000 or something at the time? He had like 1 million SA men under arms. He would have just absorbed the German army. Now, this is interesting because Röhm, he was a captain in the German army in World War I, and Hitler worked for him. And this gets back to Hitler joining the party in the first place. And, we don't need to go too much into it, but there's a very interesting part of German history there that used to be talked about more, but after the war, it didn't really fit in with the narrative. So it's been quietly forgotten, although the information's there. And in fact, I think you and I watched that old movie, The Hitler Gang.
Yeah, it was mentioned on the documentary that we watched last night.
Yeah, that had some the information that they didn't like to talk about much. But the reason Hitler joined the party was he was working for German army intelligence. He was an intelligence agent. And, this is all part of the tradition of leaders who start off in the intelligence services, like Putin worked for the KGB, George Bush worked for the CIA, and Hitler worked for German military intelligence. And Röhm was his paymaster. And he joined the party as a secret agent, and he stayed and took over the party. And I don't want to go into it too far, but it's just interesting. The political aspects of the time were much more complicated than generally people are led to understand.
Or just more complicated than the average person is willing to absorb and get some kind of handle on.
Oh yeah, but you could stress things more, like the early Nazi Party was funded in part by the German army as an attempt to save German militarism. That Hitler was receiving a lot of money from bankers, many of them Jewish, because as David Irving said, Hitler didn't give a shit of who you were. He would take your money. He was very pragmatic that way. Above all, he was and again, this is the physical Hitler, was a pragmatic politician. And that gets to the anti-Semitism in the party. Now there were some members of the party. They were bloody, really heavy anti-Semites. Goebbels hated Jews. He did not like them at all. And it's interesting because when you read the Goebbels diaries, and this gets back to an idea that you always hate people you harm. He starts with like, these Jewish people, I wonder about this, and dating a Jewish girl and this and that. Then later on you read about, well, I did this and expelled all these Jews from here. The next thing is like, rotten Jew. Every time he would do something to harm Jewish people, the next entry would be how awful the Jewish people are. The more you hurt someone, the more you come to hate them. I don't know if anyone else ever noticed that, but maybe it was just me, but I kind of noticed until by the end of the war, he is working like crazy to get the last 300 Jews out of Berlin that they actually needed there for war work. You know, there was a lot of resistance to expelling the Jews from Germany from unlikely quarters, you'd think. One of the things was, they wanted to get rid of all the Jews in the civil the civil service. And it's like, you'd lose like half your judges, you'd lose like, 3/4 of your clerks. I mean, on the one hand, that's kind of interesting, but on the other hand, everything would grind to a halt. It was like when they expelled the Jews and the Moors from Spain in 1492, and suddenly, like, 90% of the people that could read and write and add were like driven out of the country.
There went most of the doctors.
Yeah. Oh, the doctors too was another. That was less of a problem, I think, but to the government, but yeah. So, and again, it's so difficult to separate the physical avatar from the spiritual Hitler that we have today. But yeah, there is the Hitler channel. It's a fascination. You can go online or go onto the History Channel or the Hitler channel and just watch hour after hour after hour of Leni Riefenstahl films and newsreels and stuff. There is a great power there, and it's not surprising that occultists would be drawn to it, that religious people would be drawn to it, and it would tap it.
And there has been somewhat of a resurgence, I think, largely because we are becoming the new Weimar Republic in the West, sort of liberal and weak and decadent, and just anything goes. Sort of like the movie Cabaret, where in a way that was just trying to reflect on modern times. It's sort of comparing the Weimar Republic with modern America.
Right.
And, there is some truth to that, and we are becoming more and more polarized, just like Germany was at the time. We're entering upon hard times and increasing inflation and so forth, like Germany was at the time. And it's one reason why the Nazis took power. I mean, they were, before Hitler was chancellor, they were never a majority in politically or according to the population. It's just that it was becoming so polarized, the country was, that the middle was just evaporating. You had to choose either the communists or the Nazis, because they were the ones that were, it was like a dumbbell-shaped political scene where you had the communists and the Nazis, and then everything in between was just spinning out.
Oh yeah. And like I was saying, a lot of people, I think, just lean towards the Nazis because otherwise you have the commies, and they already knew what the commies would do to them, and at least the Nazis talk real pretty, and it was one of those things where, damned if you do, damned if you don't, at the end of the day. But you're right. There are times in history where the center just gets silenced for some reason. And
it was also a time of great disillusionment. After World War I, it was just widespread disillusionment that resulted in a lot. The Roaring '20s and Weimar Germany and so forth.
Yeah.
And people just instinctively need something to believe in. They want to belong to a tribe. And so something like this could happen again. I'm not saying that it's good, but I think it would be better than the Brave New World Order that the globalists have in mind.
Yeah.
I mean, without the the executions and so forth, without the liquidations, but
right.
Still, I mean, there is a call for some sort of unifying paradigm or belief system that will cause sort of that group mind that was being cultivated at the Nuremberg rallies and so forth.
Yeah, unifying people. Well, that was a time before television. Goebbels would have loved television. Actually, humans were developing television, but they were using it to make television-guided missiles and stuff like that. So they had no idea of how useful a propaganda tool it would be. They did distribute radios very widely to German people.
Yeah, newsreel was big in those days.
So they were trying to take that Nuremberg rally and extend it electronically into the rest of the state. It would have been interesting to see, you know, if National Socialist State had survived, how its propaganda machine would have developed. I almost think we would have seen our own TV culture a few decades earlier, except of course much more state control. But you know, it's interesting getting back to that whole unity that they were trying to make and fighting the commies. I'm just reminded of again something a lot of people don't know. When the Nazis were having elections, I think this you know I think it was like 33 or something. But it was when the Nazis were first coming to power and first gaining power, and they had more and more electoral successes. They managed to get more and more official posts. Goering was the guy that was originally in charge of the concentration camps, the KZ, and as they were.
Yeah, he was like their only representative in Parliament or whatever it was called in those days too.
The Reichstag.
Yeah.
But so before the elections, he decided, well, I'm going to set up a concentration camp, and I'm going to like round up political opponents, keep them from having trouble at the polls. Maybe round up a couple of opposition politicians. Actually, the exact same thing they do in like Egypt, for example, does the same thing. They round up all the political dissidents, they put them in a camp. So this wasn't that out too much. But one of the things that happened was that the SA, you know, he was using the SA to do all this, the brown shirts. They started setting up their own camps. Wildcat concentration camps, if you can imagine this. Again, no orders from above. They would just, and then they just go start rounding people up.
Yeah, I think Putsch had a little bit of that going on too, where the SA would just sort of, you know, they would write in a few extra people that were supposed to be taken care of.
Doing their prescriptions and stuff. Well, one of the funny, well, not really funny, it was terrible, but I mean, it wasn't just like political enemies. It's like, you know, if you owed somebody a lot of money, you know, oh, geez, he got shot trying to escape. And that was actually when they first started doing the shot trying to escape thing became popular. And Goering could not rein them in. I mean, eventually they did, but he was too scared to do anything about it. So again, this was not, politically speaking, a uniform party. There were elements of it, but again, this is one of the reasons why Hitler came down so hard on the Rome Putsch. Although, by all accounts, Hitler was under the impression that Rome was receiving money from the French government to overthrow Hitler, so that they'd have someone more congenial. I don't know whether that's true or not. Certainly, after the war, the French denied any such thing. And I mean, why would they deny? You know, I don't think they have anything really to hide about it. Maybe they did. But yeah, very good intelligence was presented to Hitler that Rome was planning on offing him very quickly. So he thought he was like getting a jump on it. At the same time, though, this evidence was presented by some of Rome's political enemies, and it was extremely, what's the word I'm groping for? It was very convenient for Hitler at the time to have Rome disappear from the stage, because it did bring the army into his camp. Hitler was a traditionalist in a lot of ways. He was really more worried about what the army thought of him, although he was always very insecure about his officers. He didn't like these upper-class Prussians that were running things. And a very interesting thing, Wilhelm Keitel was his, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, I'm sure we'll have remarks if I'm not, that was his top military, his top army officer. And he was in this the Wolfslayer when the Stauffenberg bomb went off. Boom. And you know, people were hurt and killed. It was all rubble. I'm sure you've seen pictures. And I guess what happened was Hitler was like, all, you know, he's all fucked up and his clothes half blown off, and
yeah, pant leg thing.
Yeah, and Keitel was there too, and all messed up. And Keitel comes over and says, "Let me help you," and actually helped him get out of the bunker. And at that time, that late in the war, that late, he said, "Wow, Keitel, okay, he really does like me." I mean, this was his top army guy. Up to that moment, he basically distrusted him. So yeah, there was a lot of distrust. There was a lot of infighting and a lot of percolation of emotions. It was like the whole party was like an emotional hothouse up there.
Well, to some degree, I mean, I've read that Hitler cultivated that to some degree, where, you know, he'd have more than one person in charge of the same thing and just keep everybody against each other, and in order to, you know, remain in control.
Yeah, you know, I think I think a lot of that was he was making a virtue of a necessity. At the same time, he did see that it was an effective way to control. I mean, he was no Louis XIV. What he did have was a kind of Trumpian common sense approach to government in some ways, and that was responsible for some of his successes.
And unpredictability.
And unpredictability, which was responsible for others. But unlike Trump, he didn't trust his own experts, and that's one of Trump's strengths as well as one of his weaknesses. Is, I mean, I know guys like Trump. He's a businessman. He's not a politician. And if he needs something done, he picks somebody. Something medical. All right, you're a doctor. What should we do? Okay, we'll do that. Trump takes advice from specialists, from his advisors, and then he stops thinking about it. He doesn't worry about it. Hitler got too much into the micromanaging, and especially when he took over personal direction of the war. At that point, that between his health at the time and I don't know, I'm not downplaying also the fact that he was correct that a lot of his officers simply did not like him. The reactionaries, the conservatives did not like the Nazis any more than the commies did. And there were a lot of people working against him at the time. Not as many as came out afterward, after they left. Oh, yeah, I was against them too. But there were significantly high-ranking officers that were doing everything they could to, screw up what he was trying to accomplish. So, but we are moving away from the spiritual aspects of these things. It's the work itself which is so fascinating. So
I had it for more than an hour. So maybe we should, if you got any things to wrap this up, I think we could.
Well, the only thing I'd say is that, again, and this is like I've said, as far as esoteric Hitlerism goes, or the spiritual aspects of having Adolf Hitler as an archetype, I think this has to be kept completely separate from the physical politician that ruled Germany in the 30s and 40s. The physical Adolf Hitler is one thing. The archetype of Adolf Hitler is something entirely different. And ne'er the twain shall meet, except, the obvious similarities.
Yeah, although there has to be some kind of connection. It's like I'm not trying to compare Hitler with Jesus of Nazareth, but still there's the similar thing that Jesus and Christ. I mean, there were some Gnostic sects that considered them to be two entirely different entities.
Right.
But
right.
I mean, you could do that. I mean, you had like the Führer spirit who descended into Adolf, and that kind of a thing.
There's that argument actually that was what descended into him during the speeches.
Yeah.
On the other hand, though, I'm aware that he was very careful about how he did this. He trained, he practiced. You've probably seen the famous photographs of him making all the Roman gestures and oratorical gestures and things like that. So he was very aware of his art as a propagandist. He was he didn't just walk out on the stage, after having a near beer. He drank this zero alcohol beer and walked out and hoped for the best. He was very aware of his art, but he was an artist. And I think he brought his artistic sensibilities to public speaking the way any artist would. He did have that aspect of him.
He channeled lightning.
Yeah. So that's probably a good place to wrap it up, I guess.
All right. Yeah, and at the end, I will remind everyone again that I'm really not a Hitlerist or a Nazi or a fascist, but it is an interesting subject, and I think it should be discussed simply because it is taboo, and there are people trying to shut down anything other than progressive ultraliberalism, and to hell with progressive ultraliberalism, and so there we are.
And I'd also say that you cannot deny the fascination that Adolf Hitler has. Again, just his name gets a physical reaction from people. His image is instantly recognized. This is a very powerful image, a very powerful presence in our collective psyche, and you can't ignore these things. And indeed, these things are the great sources of power. If you're an occultist, or if you're a spiritually minded person of any sort, if you're religious, there's an old saying that private religion is magic, public magic is religion. The two are actually very much part of the same continuum. So the power is definitely there, and the fact that people might get very upset about this video just shows that it's what's the old saying? Hitler's living in your mind rent free, and he's doing it for most of the West right now. That's power. That's power.
Yeah, Hitler derangement syndrome.
There you go.
Yeah. And he remains the dankest meme.
I agree. Hitler is the dankest meme.
So thank you for the conversation. We should do this again sometime.
Yeah, sounds good. We can get together maybe next week.
Yes, that's possible.
All right. Well, we'll stay in touch. Figure
All
it
right.
out.